She did not ask for help, not once. For 47 days she chopped wood alone in the snow, fixed what broke, ate what was easy, and told herself she was fine. She was not fine. And somewhere in the tree line, about 80 feet from where she stood every morning with that axe, a man was watching. Not because he was strange, not because he was lonely, but because he recognized something in the way she moved the too-fast rhythm, the rigid back, the counting, and he understood, from his own years of carrying things he couldn't put down, exactly what he was looking at. He watched for 3 days. He left firewood in the dark so she would not freeze. He did not speak until she called him out, because he knew. And this is the thing this story is really about, that some people need to be seen before they are ready to be heard. And rushing that is not kindness. It is just a different kind of pressure. This channel is where the West lives in its open skies and hard winters, in the people who love each other slowly and honestly, in the stories of cowboys and mountain men and strong women who carry more than anyone sees, and in the quiet truth that human beings were made to take care of one another. What this story will give you is something worth keeping. It will remind you that being helped is not weakness, that the bravest thing is not refusing to fall. It is believing you deserve to stand back up. And that sometimes the person who saves you does not arrive loud or fast. Sometimes they stand in the trees for 3 days, leaving wood in the dark, waiting for exactly the right moment. If this story reaches something in you, and it will leave a comment below, and tell me what it opened up. Share it with someone who is chopping wood alone right now and doesn't know anyone is watching. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. Every story on this channel is a reason to stay.
The snow came in hard that morning, not the pretty kind, not the kind people in Denver drove up to photograph on weekends. This was the real thing, heavy, sideways, mean. The kind that settled into the gaps of your collar and found the backs of your hands no matter how well you tucked them. The kind that the old-timers in Crested Butte called a working storm, because it didn't care how you felt about it. It just kept coming. And Margaret Calloway, Maggie, always Maggie, nobody called her Margaret except her mother and the hospital board, was standing in the middle of it, axe raised, alone. First swing. The pine log split clean down the center, both halves tumbling into the snow. Second swing. Third. She didn't stop, didn't look up, didn't give the cold so much as a glance of acknowledgement. She just kept going, the way she had been going for 47 days now. Methodically, precisely, without asking anyone for anything. The cabin sat maybe 30 feet behind her. Old, solid. Built by her Uncle Raymond sometime in the 1970s when he came up here to get away from a life that had stopped working for him. He'd left it to her in his will, along with one sentence that wasn't legal language. This house is not for selling. It is for living in. Raymond had been the only person in her family who ever said things like that to her. Plain things, true things, things that didn't need a degree to understand. She missed him the way you miss a door that used to be open. The boiler had quit 2 days ago. She had wood for the backup stove, but not enough. And the storm that the radio had warned about, before the battery died, was already here. So she was out here at 7 in the morning, coat on, gloves on, axe in hand. No phone, no help, no plan except to split enough wood to survive the next few days. She counted the swings, not to keep rhythm, to keep the other thing out. The other thing that lived in the back of her skull and came forward whenever she stopped moving. The operating room, the overhead lights, the sound of the monitor going flat at 3:14 in the morning, and her own hands shaking over a 7-year-old boy named Tyler, who had needed her to be steadier than she was capable of being that night. She counted. 14, 15, 16. The split wood piled up in the snow beside her. She was halfway through the second round of logs when she noticed the disturbance at the tree line. just a small thing. A patch of snow disturbed at the base of the pines, maybe 80 feet out. Probably deer. There were a lot of deer up here this time of year. She noted it and went back to work. She didn't look twice, but something had. She found the extra wood the next morning. She came out in the gray early light, breath clouding in front of her face, and stopped on the porch steps. Her stack was bigger, noticeably bigger. She had split 24 pieces the day before. There were at least 20 more now, large pieces, already split, stacked neatly on top of her own, the cuts fresh and pale in the cold air. She stood there for a long time. The feeling was strange, not gratitude exactly, not right away. It was something more complicated, a mix of confusion and irritation, and something underneath both of those that she didn't have a name for. Something that felt a little like being caught, like someone had seen her and she hadn't known she was being seen. She didn't like it. She had spent 47 days working very hard at not being seen. There was a single set of boot prints in the new snow coming from the direction of the northern tree line and going back the same way. Large boots, a deliberate stride. Whoever it was hadn't lingered. She carried the wood inside. Didn't say anything to the empty room. That afternoon she split another round. This time she watched the tree line, saw nothing. But the feeling didn't leave. That low, unshakable certainty that something was watching. She had felt it in operating rooms sometimes. The way a room changes when someone else comes in even before you hear the door. She went inside before dark, ate instant soup standing at the kitchen counter, watched the snow through the window, went to bed. The third morning she found the tinder bundle. It was sitting on top of the wood stack, a neat bundle of dry grass and birch bark strips tied with a short piece of twine. The kind used to start a fire in a wood stove built before 1980. Her uncle's stove, which she had been struggling to light properly because she hadn't known, until this moment, exactly what it needed. She stood holding the bundle in both hands. The snow was falling again, light this time, soft, settling into her hair. She looked at the bundle, looked at the tree line, thought about all the times her Uncle Raymond had told her that the mountains taught you things if you let them. She wasn't sure what this was teaching her yet. She set the bundle down on the porch railing, picked up the axe, started splitting the morning's round. But she didn't count this time. This time she listened. She worked through the morning's first chord without stopping. She felt it before she heard it. The exact moment the quality of the silence changed. There was a presence at the tree line. Close. Still. The same weight in the air she'd felt for 3 days. She drove the axe into the splitting block, left it there, didn't turn around. "I know you're out there," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was good at steady. 20 years of surgery had given her that. "You can come out, or I can keep pretending you're not." The snow fell. Wind moved through the tops of the pines with a low sound like breathing. Then, somewhere in the trees, a branch shifted. Snow fell from it in a soft rush. And footsteps came toward her, slow, deliberate, not sneaking, not hurrying, just walking, the way someone walks when they've already decided what they're going to say and they're not afraid of it. She turned around. He was taller than she expected, big through the shoulders, with the kind of build that comes from years of physical work rather than any gym. A flannel coat worn soft at the elbows, 3 days of dark stubble going gray at the jaw. And eyes. She noticed his eyes because they were the first thing that surprised her. The color of glacier water. Not cold, just careful. The kind of eyes that had looked at a lot of hard things and learned to stay open anyway. He stopped about 10 feet from her. The right distance, close enough to talk, far enough to leave her room. She looked at his hands, calloused, used to work. She always looked at people's hands first. "Who are you?" she asked. "Eli Voss," he said. His voice was low and even, no performance in it. "I have a place about 2 miles north by trail. You didn't think to ask before putting wood in someone else's yard." He was quiet for a moment, not flustered, just thinking. "Your boiler's out. Temperature dropped to 4 below 2 nights ago. If I'd asked, you'd have said no." What makes you think that? Because in 47 days, he said, you haven't asked anyone for a single thing, even when I could see you needed it. Maggie looked at him steadily. He had been counting. He had been out here, watching, counting the days she'd been alone on this mountain, and he had said it without embarrassment, as a simple fact. Can you fix boilers? She asked. Yes. Come look at it then. Look. He worked in silence. That was the first thing she noticed. He came inside, assessed the old unit in the utility room off the kitchen, got down on the floor with a flashlight, and worked without commentary. He didn't look around the cabin in the curious way visitors usually did, cataloging, measuring, forming opinions. He just focused on what was in front of him. She stood in the doorway and watched him. The cabin looked the way it had looked for 47 days. No photographs on the walls. She had taken them down in the first week because she couldn't figure out which ones to keep, and putting them back up felt like a decision she wasn't ready to make. No personal things on surfaces. Her uncle's old medical texts on the bookshelf, a journal on the side table that had never been opened, last night's pot still in the sink. Eli looked at none of it. After about 20 minutes, he sat back on his heels. Needs a new valve. I have one in my shop. I can bring it tomorrow. I can get one in town, she said. It's a specific size for this model. Old. You won't find it at the hardware store in Crested Butte. He stood up, wiped his hands on his work pants. I'll bring it tomorrow. She opened her mouth. He spoke before she could. How many years did you study medicine? She went still. How do you know that? The way you check the pipe connections before you let me start. Touch first, look second. That's a diagnostic reflex, not something people just have. Maggie looked at him for a long moment. He looked back without pressure, no agenda in it. 22 years, she said, if you count medical school. He nodded, as if that answered something he hadn't asked aloud. Then he picked up his tools, said, tomorrow then, and walked out the door into the snow. She stood in the warm utility room, warm because the backup elements were working again, at least partially, and listened to his footsteps cross the porch and disappear. She went and sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the wall, not because her legs gave out, just because the floor felt like the right place. And she cried. Not much. And she wasn't sure why. Not grief, exactly, or not only grief. Something more like the way pressure releases when a valve opens. For 47 days she had been sealed completely closed, and a man she didn't know had come in, fixed what was broken, looked at nothing he wasn't supposed to look at, and left without asking a single question about any of it. She pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth and let it pass. Outside the window, snow kept falling. The pile of extra firewood sat in the yard, already dusted white again. She was still there when the room got dark. He came back the next morning at 8. She heard the truck on the road and was already dressed, coffee on, by the time his boots hit the porch steps. He knocked twice, not loud, not tentative, just a knock that said, I'm here, not rushing you. She opened the door. He was carrying the valve, a small toolbox, and a canvas bag she hadn't expected. He held up the bag. Carrots, potatoes, smoked pork shoulder. Before she could react, he added, That's not a gift. I need something in return. She leaned against the door frame. What? I have a horse, Appaloosa, 12 years old. Got into some barbed wire 4 days ago. Deep gash on the lower left leg. I've been managing it, but I don't have enough hands to hold him steady and treat the wound at the same time. He trusts me enough not to bolt, but not enough to stay still through a cleaning. He paused. You're a doctor. Surgeon, human anatomy. Similar enough, and you know that. She did know that. She looked at the bag, looked at him. He stood there without filling the silence with more argument, which she found unusual. Most people, when they wanted something, kept talking until they got it. Eli Voss seemed comfortable with the idea that she might say no. Fix the boiler first, she said. Then we go look at your horse. He nodded and came inside. The valve took 40 minutes. She made coffee while he worked and brought him a cup without asking if he wanted one. He took it, drank half, set it on the floor beside him, kept working. They didn't talk. It wasn't awkward silence. It was just two people who had both spent a lot of years in situations where conversation wasn't the main event. When the boiler clicked on and the heat began to move through the old pipes of the cabin, Eli stood up, stretched his back, and finished the coffee. "Horse first," he said. "Or do you want to walk?" "Walk," Maggie said. "I'll drive back." His property was 2 miles north by the trail that ran along the creek, and another half-mile up a rise to where the land opened out into a clearing. The house sat at the back of the clearing. Timber frame, 2 stories, built solid and plain with nothing decorative about it, except the care that had gone into every joint and corner. A barn to the east, a fenced pasture that wrapped around behind both buildings, empty now, the ground covered in snow. She noticed everything in the way she noticed things. Cataloging, storing. The covered wood pile 3 times the size of hers. The sled by the barn door, its runners clean and oiled. The boot scraper on the porch. The kind made from a horseshoe welded to an iron plate. The kind people made themselves. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 9 years. "You built all this?" "Most of it. First summer I was here, I slept in the truck and built the frame. Took 3 years to get it the way I wanted." She didn't ask what he'd been doing before. He didn't offer it. Ranger was in the barn, in the second stall from the end. He was a big horse, broad through the chest with the mottled coat pattern of an Appaloosa, spots of chestnut and cream blending into a roan across his hindquarters. He turned to look at them when they came in, ears moving, nostrils wide. "Hey," Eli said quietly. The horse lowered his head slightly. Something in the way they acknowledged each other, easy without performance, told Maggie that these two had been through a few things together. She moved to the stall gate. Ranger watched her come. She let him smell her hand before she opened the gate, waited until his ears went soft, then stepped inside. "Hold his head," she said to Eli. "Stand on his left side, your hand on his jaw. Don't grip, just contact. And watch his ears, not his eyes. When they flatten, he's about to move." Eli stepped in, positioned himself the way she'd said, and put his hand gently on the horse's jaw. Ranger shifted his weight once and then settled. Maggie crouched to look at the wound. It was on the lower cannon bone, a diagonal cut about 3 inches long, deep but clean at the edges, showing early signs of proud flesh forming on one side. She pressed around it with 2 fingers, watching the horse's response. "This is about 4 days old. 4 days yesterday. He's been weight-bearing?" "Yes, limping but bearing weight." "Good, that's good." She stood. "I need warm water, clean cloth, and whatever antiseptic you have. And something to rewrap it, not cotton wool, something tighter." Eli didn't ask any questions. He had everything she named in 3 minutes. They worked on Ranger for the better part of an hour. She cleaned and treated, Eli held, and the horse tolerated both of them with the patience of an animal that has been handled well for a long time. When it was done, Maggie stripped her gloves, dropped them in the waste bucket, and stood up straight. Her back ached from crouching on the barn floor. She hadn't noticed it while working. "He needs to stay off hard ground for at least a week," she said. "The proud flesh is going to want to overgrow. You'll need to clean and redress every 2 days. I can show you the technique if you want." "I'd appreciate that," Eli said. She looked at Ranger, who was nosing at the grain bucket in the corner, apparently unbothered by the entire procedure. "He's got a good temperament. He's never given me anything else." Eli latched the stall gate. They walked back out of the barn into the cold air. He looked at her. "You want to come in? I'll make lunch." She almost said no. She had the words ready. The automatic no that she'd been using for 47 days like a reflex. "Yes," she said instead, and surprised herself. His kitchen was the warmest room in the house. A wide wood stove in the corner, a table built from a single plank of pine, 2 chairs on one side and a bench on the other. He made soup from the smoked pork and whatever vegetables were left in the root cellar under the house. carrots, parsnips, half a head of cabbage. She sat at the table and watched him work. There was a painting on the wall above the kitchen door. She noticed it because it was the only piece of decoration in the entire downstairs of the house. A watercolor, small, maybe 10 by 12 inches, of a desert landscape, pale ochre hills, a flat road, a sky that was brilliantly blue on the right side and simply stopped, half-finished, on the left. The horizon line had no light in it. She looked at it for a while. "I painted that 6 years ago," Eli said without turning around. "Never finished it." "Why not?" He put 2 bowls on the table, sat down across from her, poured coffee from the pot. "Not ready to, I guess." She looked at the painting one more time. She understood that answer. She had an open journal at home that she'd been not writing in for the same reason. They ate. Outside the window, the snow had lightened to a thin flurry, and through it you could see the tree line, and above that, the white slopes of the mountains going up and up until they were gone in cloud. "You grew up here?" she asked. "No, Oregon. Moved around after that." He didn't elaborate. "You're from Denver?" "Colorado, originally. Grew up in Montana." "Ranch?" She looked at him. "How'd you know?" "The way you handled the horse, like you've been around them a long time." He paused. "And the way you handled the axe. That's not something you learn in a hospital." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "My father was a hunting guide. Rural county, northwest Montana. I grew up in those woods before I went to college." Eli nodded. He didn't say anything else, but there was a quality to his listening that she hadn't encountered often. A completeness to it. Like he was genuinely placing what she told him somewhere in his understanding and leaving room for more. They finished eating. She helped clear the bowls. At the door, she pulled on her coat, and he handed her the canvas bag. He had already packed it, the carrots, potatoes, and pork he'd brought that morning. "You don't have to do that," she said. "We had an agreement," he said. "I held up my end. So did I." "Then you should have these." She took the bag, stood on his porch for a moment, looking out at the clearing and the trees beyond. "Someone's been asking about me in town," she said. She didn't know why she told him. It came out without much premeditation. "A lawyer, apparently, from Denver." Eli's expression didn't change dramatically, but something shifted behind his eyes. "What did he want?" "I don't know yet. I haven't returned the calls." He nodded slowly. "You should probably return them." "I know." She walked back through the snow toward the trail. She didn't look back. But she felt him watching her until the trees closed around her, the same way she had felt him watching for 3 days. It didn't feel like being watched anymore. It felt like something else, something she didn't have a name for yet. She returned the calls the next morning. The 11 messages from the unknown number were all the same man. His name was Conrad Whitfield. He was an attorney with Whitfield and Associates in Denver. He was very interested in speaking with her at her earliest convenience regarding a property matter that could be mutually beneficial. Mutually beneficial. She had heard that phrase in hospital boardrooms. It never meant what it sounded like. She texted back. "Available Thursday, 10 a.m. She didn't call. She wanted a record. The 3 messages from Daniel were shorter. Her ex-husband's voice still had that particular careful quality he'd developed in the last year of their marriage. Measured, like a man who had learned to watch where he stepped. He said he hoped she was doing well. He said he'd heard she was in Colorado. He said there might be something she needed to know about, and he thought she should hear it from him first. She put the phone face down on the table. She didn't call him back. Not because she was angry. The anger had burned through a long time ago, leaving something quieter and heavier behind. She didn't call because she didn't have the energy yet to perform whatever version of herself he expected to hear on the line. She went outside and checked on the wood pile. Then she walked the 2 miles north to Eli's barn. It became a routine in the way that practical things become routines, not by decision, just by repetition. She came to check Ranger's wound every other day. Eli was usually in the barn or the yard when she arrived. He always seemed to have something else that needed doing, and somehow it always required two people. First week, the barn roof had a weak section that had taken on too much snow load, and the whole north corner needed re-bracing from inside before the next big storm hit. He worked from above. She passed materials up from below. They didn't talk much, but they moved well together, each adjusting naturally to the other's rhythm without discussion. Second week, she noticed the water line to the barn was running slow and suspected a partial freeze in the section that ran outside before going underground. She was right. They dug it out together in 2 hours, wrapped the exposed section in proper insulating tape that she found in the utility shed, and packed the trench back. Her back hurt for 2 days afterward. She didn't mention it. What grew between them in those 2 weeks was not conversation exactly. It was something that happened in the spaces between conversation, in the easy way they worked, in the small adjustments they made for each other, in the fact that neither of them asked the other for explanations they weren't offering. Eli never asked why she had left Denver. She never asked about the unfinished painting. Instead, he taught her things, practical things. He showed her how to read weather by watching the way clouds moved over the western peaks. When they stacked in vertical columns, you had 6 hours before snow. When they pulled apart into streaks, the cold was breaking. He showed her which wood burned longest in an old wood stove, how to maintain the flue so it didn't clog with creosote in the deep winter. In exchange, though neither of them called it exchange, she taught him things too. How to spot the early signs of joint ill in a horse's lower leg before it became serious. How to take a pulse in a large animal with one hand while keeping the animal calm with the other. How to distinguish between pain response and fear response, and why it mattered. "You're very good at this," he said one evening, watching her rewrap Ranger's leg with a competence that had nothing to do with animal medicine specifically, and everything to do with 20 years of understanding bodies. "Hands remember things," she said. She said it simply, but she felt the weight of it as soon as the words left her mouth, and she didn't look at him. He didn't press it. They had their first real evening together in the middle of the second week. He had been helping her seal a draft gap in the cabin foundation, a slow job in cold weather requiring patience and steady hands. And by the time they finished, it was past dark. She had made coffee before they started, and there was still some left, and she warmed it on the stove and poured 2 cups without thinking about it, the way you pour for someone you've been having coffee with for years. They sat at her kitchen table, his elbows on the worn wood, her hands wrapped around her mug, and the silence was a different kind than the working silences. It had more room in it. "You said you were in the Army," she said. "Army Medical Corps, 3 deployments, Afghanistan. When did you get out?" 11 years ago. He drank his coffee. "You?" "I stopped practicing 18 months ago." She looked at the table surface. "Left the hospital." "Voluntarily?" "Yes." He nodded, didn't ask the natural next question. Why? She had come to understand in the past 2 weeks that Eli's silences weren't the silences of disinterest. They were the silences of someone who understood that some answers weren't his to ask for. "Do you miss it?" he said eventually. She thought about it honestly before answering. Parts of it. The work itself. The actual mechanics of surgery. The way a procedure comes together when everything is calibrated correctly. That I miss. She paused. The rest of it. The hospital politics, the pressure, being the person everyone expected me to be. I don't miss that at all. What about the people? The patients? That's complicated. You don't have to answer that. No, I know. She looked at her coffee. I think about them. I always will. That doesn't go away. She glanced up at him. Did it go away? For you? The people from the field? Something moved across his face. Not pain, exactly. Something that lived one layer below pain. No, he said. It doesn't go away. You just learn to carry it differently. How? He was quiet for a moment. You stop trying to put it down. That's the beginning of it, anyway. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. I spent a long time trying to get to the point where I could set it down and walk away from it. When I finally stopped trying to do that, when I just let it be something I was going to carry, it got lighter. Not gone. Lighter. Maggie sat with that. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the pines with a low, persistent sound. Your grandmother used to say something like that, Eli said. Not to me. I never knew her well enough for that. But my mom told me, she said Margaret used to say, you don't outgrow grief. You grow into it. Maggie looked up. What was her name? Margaret Voss. She lived on this mountain for about 25 years. That's part of why I came here. He set down his cup. I'm sorry. I should have mentioned that earlier. Your uncle knew her. Raymond. They were neighbors. Something shifted in Maggie's chest. Not a dramatic shift, just a small, quiet rearrangement of things. Uncle Raymond had known a Margaret on this mountain. She had never thought to ask about his neighbors. She had never thought to ask him much of anything, the way you don't ask the people who love you enough questions while you still have the chance. I didn't know that, she said quietly. I figured you might not. They sat with that for a while. The coffee went cold. Neither of them moved to warm it. It was getting late. Eli stood, gathered his jacket from the hook by the door, and paused. Someone put a printed notice on the board at the post office in town today, he said. I saw it when I went in for supplies. Meridian Development Group. They're holding a community information session about a new project in the area. Resort development. He looked at her steadily. The name Conrad Whitfield is listed as contact. Maggie said nothing. I thought you should know before your meeting Thursday, he said. Thank you. He left. She sat at the table alone and watched the candle she'd lit for extra light burn down in its holder, the flame going thin and straight in the still air of the cabin. She opened the journal for the first time, found a pen, wrote one line. I did real work today, and I felt for the first time in longer than I can name like I was worth something. She closed it and went to bed. Conrad Whitfield arrived on Thursday in a black rental SUV that was completely wrong for these roads, but made it anyway on sheer tire quality. He was 54, well-dressed in a suit that had been chosen to communicate authority without aggression, silver at the temples, the kind of smile that arrived before the rest of the face, which was always the tell. Maggie had seen that smile in hospital boardrooms, and she knew what it meant. This person has prepared for this conversation more carefully than you have. She let him in, made no offer of coffee. He sat down at the kitchen table, her kitchen table, which he somehow made feel like a conference room, and set a folder in front of him that he did not open immediately. Dr. Calloway, he said, or do you prefer... Maggie is fine. Maggie, I appreciate you making time. He had a way of speaking that made everything sound like a mutual decision, even things you hadn't agreed to. I represent Meridian Development Group. I imagine you may have heard of the project we're developing in this area. I've heard something about it. We've been in the process of acquiring land in this corridor for the past 18 months. 6 parcels already secured. The project is a high-end mountain resort, responsibly developed, fully compliant with all county environmental requirements. Significant economic benefit for the region. He smiled again. Your property sits in a position that would be of considerable value to the project. I'm aware of where my property sits. We're prepared to offer, he named a number, a real number, high enough that she felt her shoulders tighten involuntarily. Significantly above market value. You'd be financially set for a very long time, Dr. Calloway. She looked at the folder he still hadn't opened. What's in there? A slight pause. Background materials on the project. Is that all that's in there? The smile held, but something behind it recalibrated. There's also documentation relevant to the property's inheritance conditions. Our legal team has identified a clause in your uncle's will that stipulates continuous primary residency. Given that your registered address is still in Denver, there may be a question of whether the transfer of title was fully compliant. Maggie kept her face still. It cost her something. "Additionally," he said, and now his voice went even smoother, which was the part she had been waiting for. "I understand you have a relationship with Eli Voss, who holds the adjacent parcel to the north. His property is of interest to us as well. If you were to sell first, you'd be in a good position to negotiate protective terms on his behalf." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I need some time to review my options." "Of course, take a week. I'd love to have this resolved before the county planning meeting next month." He stood, picked up the folder, placed it on the table. "This is yours to keep." After he left, she stood at the kitchen window and watched the SUV navigate the road back toward the main highway. Then she drove north. Eli was splitting rails for a new section of fencing when she arrived. He saw her face when she got out of the truck and set the maul down. She told him everything. When she got to the part about Conrad's offer to help protect Eli's property, his expression didn't change much, just a slight tightening around the jaw. "He lied to you," Eli said. "I know. I sold Meridian the western 40 acres 14 months ago. Section Y wasn't using. Helped me build the new barn." He looked at her directly. "I should have told you that before now. I'm sorry I didn't." She had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. A defense, maybe. Some version of, "It was just business." Instead, he had led with the apology and left it there. "Why didn't you?" she asked. "Because when I met you, it didn't seem relevant. And then, when it became relevant, I kept thinking I'd find the right time." He paused. "There's no right time for that kind of thing. I know that. I should have said it sooner." She looked at him for a moment. "He mentioned a residency clause in the inheritance. Is it real?" "I don't know yet. I need to talk to someone who knows property law here." "Eleanor Hayes," he said immediately. "She's been the county attorney here for 30 years, knows every parcel in these hills. Your uncle knew her." "Raymond mentioned her?" "She was his attorney when he bought this land. She handled his will." He picked up the maul again, set it aside more deliberately this time. "She's plain-spoken. You'll like her." They stood in the snow for a moment. The mountains were sharp and white above the tree line, clear today, the sky a hard winter blue. "He used you as leverage," Maggie said. "Conrad. He brought you up knowing I wouldn't want to put you in a difficult position." "That's what he does. He's good at it." Eli's voice was matter-of-fact, not bitter. "Don't let him be right about it." She drove home through the early afternoon light, thinking about the folder Conrad had left on her table. She would read it that evening. She would call Eleanor Hayes in the morning. What she thought about most, though, driving through the pines with the mountains to her right and the creek frozen solid to her left, was the way Eli had said, "I should have told you that before now." Not defending, not explaining, just acknowledging and being sorry. She had been married for 11 years, and she could count on one hand the times Daniel had done that. Eleanor Hayes had a small office above the hardware store on Crested Butte's main street, with a window that looked out at the ski mountain and a desk covered in organized stacks of paper that appeared chaotic, but probably weren't. She was 68 and had the kind of face that told you she had heard most things people could say and wasn't surprised by any of them. She read through the inheritance documentation Maggie brought in 20 minutes without comment, made 3 notes on a yellow legal pad, and then looked up. "Raymond was smarter than people gave him credit for," she said. "He registered this property as a homestead under Colorado state law in 1984. That designation grants you right of primary residence regardless of any secondary registered address. Conrad Whitfield knows this." She set the pen down. "He's not arguing a real legal point. He's arguing a psychological one. He thinks you'll be easier to pressure than to fight." "He probably had reason to believe that," Maggie said. Eleanor looked at her steadily. "Had?" Maggie met her eyes. "You're protected," Eleanor said. "The homestead designation is clear. You don't have to sell anything." She paused. "Now, personal question, not legal. Go ahead. Eli Voss came in here 8 years ago and bought 2 coffee cups when he'd been using one for 7 years. I know this because I was in the general store when he bought them, and I asked him why. She folded her hands on the desk. He said he had a neighbor who might be staying a while. You're the first neighbor he's had in 9 years. She let that sit. I'm not asking you what's between you two. I'm asking if you know what you have up there on that mountain. Maggie was quiet for a moment. I'm starting to understand it. Good. Eleanor picked up her pen. Now, here is exactly what you say to Mr. Whitfield. She called Conrad that evening. She stood at the kitchen window with her phone and the notes Eleanor had helped her draft, and she waited for him to pick up. He answered on the second ring. Maggie, I was hoping to hear from you. Conrad. She kept her voice at the register she used in difficult conversations. Not cold, not warm, just precise. I've spoken with legal counsel. The homestead designation on this property under Colorado state law protects my right of primary residency, regardless of secondary address registration. You know this, which means the residency argument isn't a legal position. It's pressure. A pause. I'd encourage you to... I'm not finished. She looked at the mountains through the glass, the peaks going gray in the evening light. You have 24 hours to withdraw all correspondence related to that argument, and confirm in writing that Meridian Development Group is not pursuing any legal action against this property. If you don't, I will contact the Colorado State Bar with documentation of how you obtained and used private medical information in the course of a business negotiation. That's a conduct violation. I've spent 20 years reading documentation, Conrad. I know what I'm talking about. The silence on the other end had a different quality now. The offer to purchase remains open, he said finally. His voice had shifted, still controlled, but the friendliness was gone. The property isn't for sale, she said. It's for living in. She hung up. Behind her, Eli was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he'd made himself. She had come home from Eleanor's to find him replacing a hinge on the pantry door that had been stiff since November, and she'd told him to stay and eat something. He had been quiet while she made the call, not pointedly not listening, just giving her the space of it. Now, he said, your surgical team must have liked you. Must. She turned from the window. What makes you say that? That call, no raised voice, no emotion, just the information, and the consequence, and the boundary. The best combat medics talk like that in triage. He drank his coffee. People follow that. They trust it. She sat down across from him. The cabin was warm from the wood stove, the light low and yellow from the lamps. Outside, the first real dark of evening had settled over the snow. I'm tired of being afraid of that man, she said. Good. You don't need to be. She looked at her hands on the table, both of them open, palms up. It was a thing she did without thinking sometimes. A check. Still there. Still hers. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. The painting, the unfinished one. She looked up. Was it from your last deployment? He set his cup down slowly. Yes. You painted it from memory? A year after I got back, I was trying to... I don't know exactly what I was trying to do. Work through something, I guess. But I got most of the way through it, and then I stopped. He was quiet for a moment. There was a ridge line in the scene, a specific one. I could get all the rest of it down. The colors, the distance, the light on the hills. But I couldn't paint that ridge without painting what happened there, and I wasn't... He stopped. I wasn't ready to look at that yet. Are you now? I don't know. He looked at her. Maybe. They sat in that for a while. The stove ticked. The wind outside was gentle tonight, moving through the pines without any of the meanness it carried in the big storms. I had a patient, Maggie said. She didn't plan to say it. It came out the way some things do when the room is the right temperature and the person across from you has just shown you something real. A 7-year-old boy, surgery at 3 in the morning. I had been on shift for 36 hours. She looked at the table. My hands shook. He didn't make it. Eli didn't say anything. The review board cleared me, and I know what that means legally. I know the protocol was correct. I know that I made the decisions I could make with what I had at 3 a.m. after 36 hours. She pressed her right hand flat against the table. But I know my hands shook, and I know that, and that just that is the thing I've never been able to put down. You've been putting it down on top of yourself, Eli said quietly. That's different from putting it down. She looked at him. What do you mean? There's a difference between carrying something and using it to hold yourself in place. He turned his coffee cup slowly. I did the same thing for years. A kid, 19 years old, my unit. There was an intersection, and I had to make a call in about 4 seconds with incomplete information, and the call I made cost him his life. The review said I acted correctly given the situation. He paused. I spent 6 years believing that if I let myself off the hook, if I said, okay, I did what I could, it would mean I didn't care enough. That the grief was the only thing proving I understood what happened. Maggie was very still. But that's not honoring him, Eli said. That's just staying, not moving. He looked at her directly. It took me a long time to understand that you can carry someone with you into a life that's worth living. That's different from standing still with them in a life you've stopped living. The fire shifted in the stove. A log settled, sending a brief brightness through the grate. Maggie looked at her hands. The right one had trembled slightly during the phone call. She had felt it, the faint vibration under the skin. My father used to say, she began, and then had to stop because she hadn't thought about her father in months. Deliberately hadn't. And his voice in her memory came back so suddenly that it caught in her chest. She tried again. He used to say, the bravest person isn't the one who doesn't fear falling. It's the one who believes they deserve to stand back up. Eli was quiet for a moment. He sounds like someone worth knowing. He was. She looked up. He died 6 years ago. Same year you painted that. Something passed between them. Not romantic, not yet. It was something earlier than that. A recognition. The particular awareness that the person across from you has been shaped by loss in a way that is similar to yours. Not in the details, but in the dimensions. Stay for dinner, she said. I was planning to, he said. And she laughed, small, surprised. She hadn't laughed in a long time, and it felt strange. The way it feels strange to use a muscle you forgot you had. But it wasn't unwelcome. Not at all. 3 days after she called Conrad, the deer appeared at the eastern edge of her property. It was early morning. She had gone out to check the snow load on the cabin's east roof when she saw it in the thin trees at the clearing's edge. A doe, large, lying on her side in the snow. Even from 30 feet away, the posture told the story. She had been on the ground for a while. There was blood in the snow around her left flank and the back leg. Mountain lion. The pattern was distinctive. The claw rake going deep before the bite that hadn't finished the job. Maggie went still. She had grown up seeing this. Her father had walked her through it a dozen times. The mercy of it, the obligation of it. You didn't leave an animal like this to die slowly. That was the first rule he taught her, before hunting, before field dressing, before any of the technical things. The first rule was, if it's suffering and it can't recover, you end it, quickly, correctly. She went inside and called Eli. He was there in 20 minutes with his rifle. They walked to the clearing's edge together and stood looking at the doe. She was still breathing. Shallow, labored. Her eye, half open, tracked them without fear. Beyond fear now. Eli raised the rifle. Maggie put her hand on his forearm. He looked at her. She held out her other hand. "Give me your knife," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then unclipped the hunting knife from his belt and placed it in her hand, handle first. She worked quickly and without hesitation. It took less than 2 minutes. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent years making precise decisions under time pressure, and the knowledge in her hands was older than any of that. It was her father's hands in her hands. The cold mornings in the Montana hills, the lessons that don't leave because they were given with love as well as purpose. When it was done, she stood up, cleaned the blade in the clean snow, and held the knife out to Eli, handle first. He took it. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not surprise, exactly. Something more like recognition of a kind he hadn't expected. "Your father taught you that," he said. "He did." "In Montana, northwest of Kalispell, we ran about 200 head and guided hunters through the fall season. I could field dress a deer by the time I was 12. She wiped her hands on the clean snow. "I don't talk about it much. People in Denver found it hard to reconcile with the surgeon part. People in Denver aren't up at 7,000 feet in January." She almost smiled. "No, they're not." He looked at her steadily. "You know what I think? Tell me." "I think you've been telling yourself you came up here to start over, but I don't think that's actually what this is." He glanced at the tree line, the mountains beyond. "I think you came up here to remember who you are, because the person who grew up in those Montana hills never went away. You just spent 20 years being someone else in front of her." Maggie was quiet. It was such a simple thing to say, and it opened something in her that was larger than what it had seemed. The way a door that looks small in a wall sometimes reveals a whole room beyond it. "You're saying I'm not broken," she said. "I'm saying you were never broken. I'm saying you got lost." He tucked the knife back in its clip. "Those are very different problems with very different solutions." She looked at the mountains. The morning light was coming down the slopes in that particular January way, clear and cold and without compromise, making everything sharp and exact. "Come to dinner tonight," he said, "at my place. I'll cook." His kitchen that evening. The same wide wood stove, the same pine table, but with more on it. A venison stew that had been going in a pot since morning. Cornbread he'd made in a cast-iron pan. The simple abundance of someone who had learned to eat well from what the land provided. She sat at the table and looked at the painting on the wall above the kitchen door. In the better light of the evening lamp, she could see more of it than she had the first time. The careful way he had rendered the texture of the desert hills. Not photographic, but faithful. The specific blue of that particular sky. And the emptiness on the left side, where the ridge line that he hadn't been able to paint yet simply became white paper. Waiting. "Tell me about him," she said. "The soldier." Eli stood at the stove, stirring the stew. He didn't answer immediately. He let the question be there in the room. "His name was Kyle," he said finally. "He was from Mississippi. He had a picture of his girlfriend in his front chest pocket, and he showed it to everyone who stood still long enough. She had red hair." He paused. "He was funny, real funny, the kind that makes everyone around him funnier just by being in the room." He set the wooden spoon down. "We were 2 weeks from rotation end. I made a call at an intersection, took a route that I thought was more secure. The intelligence I had was wrong. He was in the second vehicle." Maggie said nothing. "The thing about it," Eli said, his back still to her, "is that the call itself wasn't wrong. In the information I had at the time, it was the right call. The review board was correct about that." He turned around, leaned against the counter. "But I knew standing there in that moment, that I was tired, that I had been tired for 11 months, and that my judgment was operating on a level below what it should have been. And I made the call anyway, instead of stopping to say, I'm not sharp enough for this right now. Someone else should make this one. This. Like a surgeon operating after 36 hours, Maggie said. He looked at her. Yes, that's the part no review board sees. No, they see the decision, not the state you were in when you made it. She looked down at the table. I've never said that out loud to anyone. What you just said, I've thought it every night for 18 months, but I've never said it. Neither had I. He picked up the spoon again. Until just now. They ate dinner. The stew was good, better than good. She had 2 bowls. He noticed without remarking on it the way he noticed things, completely and without making it a weight. After dinner, walking back through the snow toward her cabin, she thought about what he'd said, that she had come here to remember who she was. She thought about her father in the hills above Kalispell, the early mornings, the smell of pine and cold air, and the particular quality of silence that you only get above the tree line. She had loved those mornings with a purity she hadn't felt about much else since. You got lost. She had. She had gotten very, very lost. And she was slowly in pieces, beginning to find the trail back. 2 weeks after Conrad's visit, a new legal notice appeared in her mailbox. Different tactic this time. Meridian's attorneys had filed a preliminary inquiry with the county assessor's office, questioning the homestead designation on the grounds that it had been registered before the current state statute was enacted, and the updated statute required re-registration to maintain the full protections. This was technical. It was expensive to fight. And it was, Eleanor told her over the phone, almost certainly going to fail. But almost certainly was not certainly, and the process would take time and money. He's not trying to win in court, Eleanor said. He's trying to wear you down. I know. Do you have the resources to fight this? Yes. She did, actually. She had been a well-compensated surgeon for 20 years, and had spent almost nothing in the last 18 months. Money was not the problem. Can you handle it? Already started, Eleanor said. But Maggie, be careful with the Voss property, too. If they can't get yours, they may push harder on his. She went to tell Eli. He was at the outdoor work table behind the barn, grinding a new edge onto a set of fence stakes when she came through the gate. He shut off the angle grinder and pushed the safety glasses up on his forehead. She told him about the new filing. He listened, his expression doing the thing it did, staying open while taking everything in. It won't work, he said. Eleanor says probably not, but it's going to require a formal response and a county hearing. You'll need documentation of continuous occupancy, utility bills, receipts, dated photos, anything with a timestamp showing you're consistently here. How do you know this? Because they did the same thing to a rancher on the south side of the valley 3 years ago. Different company, same playbook. He set down the stake he'd been holding. I'll testify to your continuous presence if it comes to that. Eli, I've seen you every other day for the past 6 weeks. I can document that. He looked at her. They're betting you're alone up here. You're not. She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming sideways through the trees, the way it did in midwinter when the sun stayed low all day, and it caught the side of his face and the careful steadiness of his eyes. Come to my place tonight, she said. I have the documents from the original inheritance. There may be something in there we're missing. They sat at her kitchen table past midnight. The power had gone out in a minor storm that came through around 8. Not a big one, just enough to knock the line. She lit candles, and they spread the papers out in the yellow light. The original deed, the will, the homestead filing, the correspondence between Raymond and Eleanor, going back to 1984. Eli read everything with the same concentration he brought to physical work. Careful, complete. He found it around 11, a letter from Raymond to Eleanor, dated 2001, in which he referenced a secondary homestead affidavit filed with the county. A document that would, if it could be located, supersede the current challenge entirely. It had not been included in the files Conrad's team had cited, because they hadn't known to look for it, or had known and hoped Maggie hadn't. This is the piece, Eli said. He set the letter down on the table. If Eleanor can find the original affidavit in the county records, the challenge collapses. Can she? If it was filed, it's there. He looked up. Raymond knew what he was doing. He spent 30 years learning how to protect this land. Maggie looked at the letter in the candlelight. Her uncle's handwriting, slanted and precise. She had forgotten that he had beautiful handwriting. She remembered sitting at his kitchen table when she was 9, watching him write letters, marveling at the evenness of it. She pressed her fingers to the edge of the paper. He loved this place, she said. I know. He used to walk the boundary every season. Eleanor told me that. He said the land knew when you paid attention to it. She smiled. A small, real one. That sounds like him. They sat quietly for a moment, the papers between them, the candles doing their small, steady work in the dark room. Maggie became aware in the way that you become aware of something that has been true for a while before you consciously register it, that she was not afraid. She was sitting here in this room that had been empty and hollow for 47 days, with documents and candles and a cup of cold coffee, and she was not afraid of anything in this moment. She noticed her right hand, closed in a fist on the table beside the papers. She had been doing that without noticing, the old reflex, tucking the trembling hand away, out of sight, protecting the thing that had failed her. Eli was looking at it too. He set down the document he was holding, and then, without a word, he placed his hand over her closed fist, not grasping, not pressing, just resting, the weight of it warm and steady, like something solid in water. She didn't move. She looked down at his hand, scarred across the knuckles, calloused from the base of every finger, a white seam along the edge of the left palm that she'd noticed before and never asked about. He didn't say anything. He wasn't explaining. He was just here, present, the way he had been present from the first day, watching from the trees, close enough to act, far enough not to intrude. She opened her fist, slowly, turned her hand over, and let her fingers rest against his. The candle nearest them guttered slightly in some draft she couldn't identify and then steadied. My hands shake, she said, quietly, plainly, the way you say a true thing when you're not performing it. The right one, mostly. I noticed it first about 2 years before the surgery. Not much, just present. And I told myself it was fatigue. And then one night it was more than fatigue. I know, he said. I saw it the first morning, when you were chopping. And you didn't say anything. It wasn't mine to say. She looked at their hands together on the table. You came back every day. Yes. You put the wood there, and the tinder. You just... She paused. You were just there. Yes. She thought about the 3 days he had watched from the tree line. The patience of it. The respect in it. Not waiting to be invited exactly, but waiting until the moment was right. Understanding that she had needed to see the wood there and then the tinder before she was ready to see him. Why, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Because you were there. And you were hurting. And I recognized it. He turned his hand slightly, settling her hand more fully in his. I've seen that kind of hurt before. In people who needed to be seen before they could accept help. And I know what happens when you push before someone's ready. He paused. I didn't want to be that. I wanted to be whatever the right thing was, even if the right thing was just wood. For 3 days. Maggie felt something unlock in her chest that she had not realized was locked. Not dramatically. It was more like a key turning in an old mechanism that has been frozen a long time. It doesn't move easily, and it doesn't swing wide open, but it moves. I had a patient named Tyler, she said, and then she told him the rest of it. Not just the surgery and the shaking hands, the 36 hours without sleep, the argument with the department head the day before, the way she had felt standing at that operating table, that she was running on will alone. And the boy's father, her colleague, who had not come into the OR that night, even though he was on call, because they had fought about a patient care decision 3 days earlier. She had not told anyone that last part. Not the review board, not her husband, not the therapist she had seen for 3 months after. She had held it very still inside herself, that particular knowledge, because using it felt like evasion. When she finished, Eli was quiet for a long time. "So you've been carrying both things," he said. "Your part and his part." I didn't feel like I could put his part down without it looking like I was avoiding mine. "Those aren't the same weight," he said. "They're two separate things. You can carry one without carrying the other." "I know that." She looked at the candle. "I've known it for a long time. She stopped. "I didn't feel like I deserved to know it." He squeezed her hand once, very gently. Just that. Then he let go and picked up his coffee cup. "I made a call in a city called Kandahar," he said. "A route choice, 4 seconds, incomplete intelligence. Kyle died because of it, and the review said it was correct given the information I had." He turned the cup in his hands. "For 6 years I refused to believe them. Not because I thought they were lying, but because believing them meant I had to start living again, and living again felt like abandoning him." He looked at her. "That's not grief. That's a way of making grief into punishment." She looked at him. "You're not punishing Tyler by healing," Eli said. "You're not dishonoring him. He was 7 years old. If there is anything of him anywhere, I don't know if I believe that, but if there is, I don't think it wants you on this mountain counting axe swings to stay sane." She pressed her lips together, looked at the ceiling for a moment, looked back down. "That," she said, her voice very level, "is the most accurate thing anyone has ever said to me about any of this. I mean it." "I know you do." She looked at him. "That's why it landed." They sat there for a while in the candlelight, not touching now, but close. The storm had passed sometime around 11, and the power was still out, but the cabin was warm, and the papers on the table represented a problem that Eleanor was already solving, and the night outside was still and clear and full of stars. "I should go," Eli said. He didn't move. "I know," she said. She didn't either. But eventually he stood and she walked him to the door, and he paused there in the way he sometimes did, not filling the space with more words, just being in it for a moment. "Tomorrow I'll talk to Eleanor," she said. "Good." "Eli." He looked at her. "Thank you for the 3 days, and for all the days after." He looked at her for a long moment, the door open behind him, the cold coming in. "Thank you for calling out when you did," he said. "On day 3. I wasn't sure if I should keep waiting." "You would have," she said. He smiled, the real one, the one that reached his eyes. "Yeah," he said. "Probably." Then he was gone into the dark, his flashlight moving north through the trees, and she closed the door and stood with her back against it in the warm quiet of the cabin. She reached up and touched the wall beside the door. Old wood, her uncle's hands in every board. She went to the table and blew out the candles one by one. In the last light before the final one went dark, she looked at her right hand, open on the table. Steady, not entirely, not perfectly, but steadier than it had been in a long time. The article appeared online on a Tuesday. Eleanor called her at 7:15 in the morning. "There's a piece in the Denver Post, online edition. It's been live since midnight." Maggie already knew. She had been looking at it on her phone since 6 a.m., sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee she had forgotten to drink. The headline read, "Former trauma surgeon retreats to Colorado mountains following patient death." It was 800 words. Everything in it was technically accurate. The surgery, the outcome, the resignation, all phrased in language that couldn't be sued but couldn't be misunderstood. The author was a freelance writer with a history of pieces that served the interests of development companies. The photo was from Denver General's website, her official staff photo, professional, looking like exactly the person the article was describing. It was, she thought, a precise and deliberate act of harm. He did this because you didn't sell, Eleanor said. I know. It changes nothing legally. I know that too. She set the phone down on the table. I need to think. She sat for a while. The morning light came through the east window slowly. The mountains were invisible in cloud today. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the snow from yesterday had crusted into something harder and less forgiving. Her phone had 6 new messages by 8 a.m. People from Denver, former colleagues. One was her ex-husband Daniel. Brief, careful, saying he was sorry, saying he hadn't known Conrad was going to do this, saying he hoped she knew that. She believed him about the last part and wasn't sure what to do with any of the rest. One was from a woman she had worked with for 11 years, a colleague she had considered a close friend. The message said, I don't know the whole story, but I want you to know that the people who worked with you know who you are. She listened to that one twice. Eli came at noon. He had read the article. She could see it in the way he came through the door, not differently, not dramatically, but with a particular quality of presence, the way a person comes in when they know they're walking into something that matters. He sat down. She poured coffee. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table where they had read documents by candlelight not many days ago. I'm not going to pretend I didn't read it, he said. Good. Don't. It's a hit piece. Written to hurt you, not to inform anyone. Yes? The facts in it are mostly accurate, she said. That's what makes it effective. He was quiet. There's a part that isn't in there, she said. She had decided, walking the property line this morning in the crusted snow, that she was going to say this, not because the world needed to know it, but because Eli did, and he deserved to hear it from her. Tyler's father. He was the attending that night. He was on call. He had the authority and the obligation to come in and assist on a case of that complexity. She paused. He didn't come because we had argued 3 days before. A patient care disagreement. He was angry. She looked at Eli. If he had come in, if there had been 2 of us, the outcome might have been different. I don't know. Maybe not. But it might have been. Eli held her gaze. You knew this the whole time. Yes. And you never said it. No. Why? Because saying it felt like deflection. Because even if it's true, and it is true, I was still there, and my hands still shook and a child still died on my table. I didn't feel like I had the right to distribute any portion of that to someone else. That's not... He stopped himself, took a breath. Maggie, that's not accountability. That's... I know what it is, she said. She wasn't defensive. She was tired. Tired in a specific way. The tiredness of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and is finally close enough to the ground to set it down. I know, I've known for a long time. But knowing something and being ready to live differently because of it are not the same moment. He looked at her. Something in his face, some guard or layer or practiced steadiness, moved slightly, showing the thing underneath. I owe you the same thing, he said. There's a version of Kyle's story I didn't tell you. The version where I knew, in the moment, not after, that I was too tired to make that call correctly. I knew it, and I made it anyway because stopping to say so would have meant admitting I wasn't okay, and I didn't know how to do that in front of my unit. She didn't speak. So I made the call, he said. And I've been telling myself ever since that it was only about the external situation, the faulty intelligence, the conditions, not about me, not about the state I was in. He looked at the table. That's the part I put in the part of the painting I couldn't finish. They sat with that. Outside, the cloud had come down further, thickening over the valley. The snow that was starting to fall was light and steady, the kind that settled without drama. So we've both been doing the same thing, Maggie said. Seems like it. Punishing ourselves and calling it responsibility. Yes. She turned her coffee cup. Conrad is going to use that article for leverage. He's going to push harder now. Let him push, Eli said. His voice was quiet and certain. He's using the thing you're most afraid of. The moment you stop being afraid of it, he has nothing. I know. Are you afraid of it? He looked at her. Right now in this room, are you afraid of it? She thought about the article, the photo, the carefully calibrated language. She thought about Tyler, and about her hands, and about 36 hours without sleep, and about the version of herself in Denver that she had been before she came here. No, she said, and meant it. She called Conrad that afternoon. He answered with the careful pleasantness he deployed when he thought he had the advantage. Maggie, he said warmly, I imagine you've seen... I have, she said. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to retract the legal challenge to the homestead designation by Friday. If you don't, I will go on record with the Colorado State Bar, the Denver Post, and any other outlet that will listen, with a documented account of how an attorney used confidential medical information to coerce a property sale. I have the records, the timeline, and the witnesses. I also have a very good attorney here who has been building this file for 3 weeks. She paused. And Conrad, you should know that I spent 20 years making life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. You are not the hardest thing I have ever faced, not even close. A long silence. The offer to purchase, he started, is declined, permanently. Another silence. The legal challenge will be withdrawn by Thursday. She hung up. Eli was in the barn. She walked out there and found him brushing Ranger down. The horse turned to look at her when she came in, ears forward. It's done, she said. He nodded. He looked at her in the low light of the barn. Steady, the way he always was. Ranger's leg is fully healed, she said. She reached over and ran her hand along the horse's leg where the wound had been. No heat, no swelling, the scar forming clean and flat. You can ride him again in a week. I know, Eli said. I've been waiting to take him up the ridge when the weather breaks. She looked at him. Take me with you. He smiled. I was going to ask. 2 weeks after Conrad's retreat, Eleanor called with news. She had found the 2001 affidavit, filed, recorded, fully legal, exactly where it should have been in the county records. Meridian Development Group formally withdrew all filings the following Monday. A brief letter arrived from Conrad's office confirming the company had concluded its review of property acquisitions in the area and was pursuing alternative sites. Eleanor read the letter aloud to Maggie over the phone and then said, Raymond would have been pleased. Maggie was at the kitchen table, afternoon light coming through the window, the mountains clear for the first time in a week. Yes, she said. He would. She sat after she hung up, just sitting in the quiet. The cabin was warm. The firewood was plentiful. Outside the window, a crow landed on the fence post. Not the injured one, or maybe it was, healed now, its wing functioning perfectly, its posture the easy posture of an animal that had recovered and moved forward. She watched it for a while. Eleanor had sent a package along with the legal confirmation. Inside was a letter in a sealed envelope. The outside read in Raymond Calloway's careful handwriting, For Maggie, when the time is right. She opened it that evening. Raymond had written it 4 months before he died. 3 pages in the handwriting she remembered from childhood, slanted and precise. He wrote about the years he had spent on this mountain, about coming here with nothing left, a marriage that had ended badly, a business career that had stopped meaning anything, a decade of drinking that he had finally, slowly stopped. He wrote about the solitude and what it had taught him. And he wrote about a woman he had met here, a neighbor, Margaret Voss, recently widowed, learning to live alone in her 60s on the mountain where she had spent her best years. We were friends, he wrote. Nothing more than that. The word just doesn't belong in front of friends. It diminishes something that was very large to both of us. We got through winters together. We watched seasons turn. And somewhere in those years, I stopped surviving and started living. I don't know exactly when it happened. That's the thing about choosing to live. You often don't notice you've chosen it until you look back and see the whole of it. He wrote, I'm leaving you this house because you are the person in this family most like me, not in personality, but in the way you carry things. You carry too much. You always have. I'm leaving you the mountain because the mountain taught me that carrying is not the same as holding yourself still. You can carry things and still move. The last paragraph. Margaret told me once that her grandson was the only person she had trusted enough to tell about this place. She said if he ever came here, he would be worth knowing. I think she was right about most things. Maggie set the letter down. She picked up her phone and called Eli. He answered on the third ring. Eleanor found the affidavit, she said. It's over. Good. She could hear the relief in his voice. I also got a letter from Raymond that Eleanor had been holding since he died. She paused. He knew your grandmother. A silence. I know. She mentioned him. He wrote about her. He said she was the person who taught him to stop surviving and start living. Eli was quiet for a moment. She used to say something like that. She'd say, the mountain doesn't care about your excuses. It only cares about what you do with the season you have. That sounds like her. It does, he paused. Are you okay? Yes, she said. And it was true, the way some things are true when they're still becoming. I think I'm starting to be. That weekend, the weather cleared entirely. She met Eli at the barn at 7 a.m. He had Ranger saddled and a second horse, a bay mare named Clara that he had been borrowing from a neighbor for the past 3 years, a calm animal with a level temperament and no bad habits, ready beside him. They rode up the trail that ran north from his property, through the lodgepole pines, and then above the tree line, into the open high country where the snow was deep and undisturbed, and the sky was the particular hard blue of high-altitude winter. At the top of the ridge they stopped. The valley spread below them. The tiny geometry of the town, the frozen creek, the roads running in straight lines between the mountains, and in one direction, the cabin, small and dark and solid, sitting in its clearing like something that had been there a very long time and intended to stay. I came up here the day after I arrived in Crested Butte, Eli said. 9 years ago. I sat up here for 2 hours and I couldn't figure out if I was staying or going. What made you stay? He was quiet for a moment. I looked down at the valley and I thought, there's work here. Real work. Building, maintaining, growing things. And I thought, if I can't fix what's in here, he put a hand briefly to his chest. At least I can build things outside that are solid and maybe one will help the other eventually. Did it? Yes, slowly. He looked at her. You? She looked at the cabin in the valley, the tiny clearing she had stood in for 47 mornings, counting axe swings in the dark, the wood pile, the fence post where the crow came. I came here because I had nowhere else to go, she said. That was the honest truth of it. Not healing, not intention, just nowhere else. She paused. But I think Raymond knew that. I think he left it to me on purpose. Because he'd been nowhere else once himself, and it had become somewhere. Eli looked at her with the particular directness he had, not searching or pressing, just present. Are you going to stay? He asked. She looked at the valley for a long time. The mountains around them, the cold, clean air, the horse breathing steadily beneath her. Yes, she said. I'm going to stay. He nodded once. Then he looked out at the valley too, and they sat on the ridge in the cold, bright morning and watched the light move over the snow and didn't say anything else for a while because nothing else needed to be said right then. On the way back down, threading through the trees, he said, Eleanor called me this morning. About? She wanted to know if I needed anything, said she'd been worrying about the north property parcels given the Meridian situation. He paused. She also mentioned, in that indirect way she has, that she thought I'd been living alone on this mountain for long enough. Maggie glanced at him. What did you say? I said I agreed with her. She looked ahead at the trail. Good, she said. And she was smiling, fully, without covering it, without needing to explain it, as they came down through the trees and into the clearing where the barn waited, and Ranger walked the last quarter-mile with his ears forward, glad to be going home. By May, the snow in the valley was gone. The mountains still held their white above the tree line, as they would until July. But the creek was running free, and the pines at lower elevation had that particular brightness of early green growth. And in the morning the air smelled like wet earth and pine resin, and something indefinably alive. Maggie had been on the mountain for 7 months. She had repainted the interior of the cabin over the winter. Not dramatically, just the walls that needed it. A warm white that made the rooms feel less dim. She had put up 3 photographs, her father on a trail in Montana, circa 1990, her Uncle Raymond standing in front of the cabin the summer he built it, and one she had printed from her phone, Eli and Ranger in the barn after Ranger's leg had healed, both of them looking at the camera with the same easy, unconcerned expression. She had opened the medical consulting practice in February. Remote work, video calls, 3 sessions a week, supporting community health workers and midwives and nursing staff in rural areas of Colorado and Montana that had no consistent physician access. The first month had been hard. The second month had been better. By May, she had 6 regular contacts, 2 of them in Montana counties where she knew the landscape and could picture the roads and the terrain between the towns when they described their situations to her. Her right hand trembled sometimes, less often now. She had stopped counting when it happened and started simply noting it, the way you note the weather. It was a Saturday in late May when Eli proposed. They were repainting the exterior window trim on the east side of the cabin, work that needed doing, that she had been putting off since fall, and that was easier with 2 people because the ladder needed holding. He was up top with the brush. She was on the ground with the paint can and the scraper. He came down to get more paint, stood beside her, looked at what they'd done so far. "I'm not good at speeches," he said. She kept scraping old paint from the sill she was working on. "I know, but I want to ask you something." She stopped scraping, set the tool down, looked at him. He was looking at her directly, the way he always did, without performance, without hedging. Just himself, standing in the morning light with paint on his hands and his flannel coat and his serious, careful eyes. "Do you want to build a life with me?" he said. "On this mountain. However that looks, I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I'm just asking if you want to do it together." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "with one condition." "What's that?" "You finish the painting." He was quiet for a moment, then he smiled. The real one. "Deal." They were married in June. Eleanor Hayes's office, the one above the hardware store, the one with the view of the ski mountain, was just barely big enough to hold the 4 of them. Maggie and Eli, Eleanor and Tom Brecker, a blacksmith of 63 who had been Eli's nearest neighbor, and the first person in Crested Butte to invite him for coffee all those years ago. Tom wore a clean shirt and looked deeply uncomfortable and deeply pleased at the same time. The vows were the standard county form, short, practical. Then Maggie added one line that wasn't in any script. She didn't plan it. It came out the way the true things came out now, without too much engineering. "I choose you, not because I'm already healed, but because being with you makes me want to keep healing." Eli held her hand. He said, "I choose you, not because I needed someone, but because you taught me the difference between needing and choosing." Eleanor made a sound that was not quite clearing her throat. Tom Brecker said, "Well," which was for Tom Brecker an emotional speech. And that evening, back at Eli's house, their house, that distinction still settling into the air between them like something that would take time to fully land, he took the painting down from the wall. She sat at the table. He brought the watercolors out, sat across from her with the painting in front of him and the brushes laid out to one side. He looked at the unfinished upper left corner for a long time, at the ridgeline that had been white paper for 6 years. Then he began. She watched him work, not talking. The kitchen was warm, the light low and good, and outside the evening was coming down over the mountains in that slow, generous way it had in the longer days of early summer. He painted the sky first, the specific blue she had seen on those particular hills. A bleached, enormous blue, the sky of a place with no moisture to soften it. Then the ridge, the line of it along the top of the painting where it met the sky. The rock formations along its edge, described in quick, confident marks that she recognized as belonging to someone who had looked at that ridge 1,000 times and knew its shape from the inside out. And then along the base of the ridge, something small, just a suggestion. A smear of gold-orange, the light of a sun that was rising or setting, ambiguous, both possible. He set the brush down. They looked at the painting together. The unfinished space was gone. The sky was whole. The ridge was there, documented, real. No longer the blank absence of a thing he couldn't look at. It was not a perfect painting. The colors on the left were slightly different from the right, 6 years apart, mixed differently. The light in the room distinct from what had illuminated the original session. You could see if you looked where the old work ended and the new work began. But it was complete, and complete was what mattered. He hung it back on the wall. 2 years later, it was January again and the snow was real again. Heavy, sideways, the mean January snow of the San Juan Mountains that did not care about your opinion of it. Maggie was at the kitchen window with her coffee. Her second cup, which she had recently started making strong because Eli drank his strong and they had arrived somewhere in the past 18 months at a shared pot instead of separate preferences. Outside in the yard, he was splitting wood. She watched him work, even rhythm. Unhurried, the axe rising and falling with the same steady cadence, each piece of pine splitting cleanly and falling to either side. He was not fighting anything. He was not counting. He was just a man doing necessary work in the cold, methodically, with the ease of someone who had found a pace that could be sustained. She thought about the first morning she had seen him. Not that she had seen him then, but that she had seen his work. The wood added to her pile before dawn, the tinder bundle tied with twine, the evidence of attention, of care, of someone who had looked at her situation and responded without making it about themselves. 3 days before he spoke. She understood it now in a way she hadn't then. He had been giving her time. Not his time. Her time. The time she needed to be ready to let anyone in at all. He had recognized from the way she chopped and the way she refused to look at the tree line that she was a person who needed to be approached very slowly and very honestly and without any hidden agenda. He had been right. She put on her coat and filled a second mug and went outside. The cold hit her face, sharp and clean, the way she liked it now. She walked to the porch railing and set the mug down where he would reach it on his next pass. He looked up, saw her, nodded once, that small, sufficient acknowledgement that she had come to know as clearly as language. She sat down on the porch steps. The snow was ankle-deep and pristine, no tracks in it yet. Above the valley, the mountains were brilliant white against the hard blue sky. Enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have existed long before you and will exist long after and cannot be improved upon. She held her coffee with both hands. Her right hand was steady this morning. It wasn't always, but this morning it was, and she noticed it the way she noticed good weather, with simple gratitude and without making more of it than it was. Behind her, through the window, she could see the painting on the kitchen wall. The ridge, now complete. The big bleached sky. The small strip of light along the horizon. The crow landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard, the same post it had been using all winter. Maggie watched it settle, watched it survey the yard with the alert confidence of an animal that knew this place as familiar territory. She reached into her coat pocket, the piece of bread she had started carrying there as habit, without thinking about when the habit had formed. She broke off a piece and set it in the snow at the base of the steps. The crow looked at her. She looked back. An old agreement between them, requiring no renegotiation. Eli's axe kept its rhythm. The snow kept falling. The mountains held their position on the edge of the sky, massive and patient and present, as they had been before any of them arrived and would be long after. She thought about Uncle Raymond writing at his table in this same cabin, in this same winter light. About Margaret Voss walking the property line in every season, paying attention the way Raymond had said she did, the land knowing it. About two people who had come here with nothing left and found in the ordinary hard work of mountain winters that living was something you could choose. About a woman 7 months ago standing in the cold counting axe swings to keep the dark thoughts at bay. And a man watching from the trees, close enough to act, far enough to give her room, waiting for exactly the right moment. She breathed in the cold air. Let it out. The woodpile was growing, the crow was eating. The mountains were exactly where they had always been. She was here, present, fully in it. Not because everything had been repaired. Some things don't repair, they only integrate. But because she had slowly, imperfectly, and with a great deal of help, she had finally let herself accept, chosen to be here. That was what her father had meant. The bravest person isn't the one who doesn't fear falling. It's the one who believes they deserve to stand back up. She had stood back up. Eli came past, reached for the mug she'd left on the railing, glanced at her, that quiet, complete glance, and went back to work. She sat on the porch steps in the snow and watched the mountains and let the morning do what mornings do. Some people come to the mountains because they have lost everything. Some people stay because they find the one thing that matters more than all of it. Themselves, seen, chosen, and finally allowed to remain. She was staying. She was home. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
There is a moment in this story that says everything. A man stands in the trees for 3 days. He watches a woman chopping wood alone in the snow. He can see she is hurting. He can see she needs help. And he does not walk out and offer it. Instead, he leaves firewood in the dark, quietly, without a name attached, without asking for acknowledgement or gratitude. He waits until she is ready. Most of us would not do that. Most of us, when we see someone in pain, want to fix it immediately. We approach, we offer, we speak. Because waiting feels like doing nothing, and doing nothing feels like not caring. But Eli understood something rare and important. There is a difference between help that serves the person who needs it, and help that serves the person giving it. Real care sometimes looks like patience. Real respect sometimes looks like staying back. The most profound thing one human being can offer another is the recognition that they have the right to their own timeline, their own process, their own readiness. That is the first lesson this story carries. Dignity is not something you give a person. It is something you protect by not taking it away. The second lesson lives inside Maggie's story. She spent 18 months punishing herself for one terrible night. And here's what made it so hard to stop. The punishment felt like responsibility. It felt like honoring Tyler, like proof that she understood the weight of what had happened. She believed that if she stopped hurting, she had stopped caring. But that is not accountability. That is a trap. And it is a trap that many good people fall into, because goodness sometimes turns against itself, because people who care deeply are also people who punish themselves deeply. What Eli helped her see was this. You can carry grief and still move forward. You can hold the weight of a mistake and still choose to live. Healing is not betrayal. Standing back up is not forgetting. It is, in fact, the only honest response to loss, because it means the loss changed you, rather than simply stopped you. The third lesson is the quietest one, and perhaps the most lasting. Love, when it is real and mature, does not arrive with conditions or urgency. It arrives the way Eli arrived, slowly, honestly, with nothing hidden. It does not ask you to be healed before it shows up. It does not require you to perform your recovery on someone else's schedule. It stands near enough to matter, and far enough to respect your space, and it lets you find your own way to the door. That is what these mountains teach. That is what Raymond learned here before Maggie arrived. That is what two broken, honest, hard-working people found in the middle of a Colorado winter, when they finally stopped pretending they were fine. You do not have to be whole to be worthy of love. You only have to be willing to keep going. And sometimes, someone will leave firewood at your door while you figure that out.